Where the Walls Breathe is a first-person found-footage psychological horror game where you play as a man trying to move out of his home after some strange events, only to find that you can't. This is a pre-release version of the game gifted to me by the developers. Atmosphere. The game starts off with a feeling of apprehension that goes through most of the game. It's visually very dark, and the dramatic lighting makes many of the house's hallways feel foreboding. But the first thing you hear is the sound of the wind rattling the house and the thunder and rain raging outside. Looking around, and the dated furniture and the VHS filter manage to make the place feel old and lonely. The lighting, or lack thereof, gives a lot of space to the shadows, and walking through the darkness and hoping to reach the light on the other side is tense somehow, like you won't make it. Something else that provides that unearthly feeling to the game is how the sound of the house is very stunted. Walking through hallways with tiled floors doesn't make a predictable sound, everything is quiet, like the house is dead. After the first diary entry arrives, the atmosphere changes, like your stomach dropping as the story is revealed. The previous occupant of the house felt like the walls are closing in on them. They said the windows were disappearing on them, and it's written well enough to invoke the feeling of dread, like you're next. Those feelings of being trapped or confined in an unnatural place start to take root. Unfortunately though, the game doesn't really change up the atmosphere in any other way than playing some more intense music when you get closer to the end, and despite working really hard on creating a sense of apprehension, the late game doesn't feel any more intense than the early game, which is a little disappointing. One of the things that could also be a problem was the progression of the game was tied to finding notes that blended into the environment, which led me personally to walk around confused, but your mileage may vary. Other than that, the atmosphere was really good for the very little it really presented. True to its psychological horror tag, the game lets you imagine the darkness around you, the promise of the walls closing in. It does a really great job of providing unease with nothing more than sound design, some notes, and the lighting. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scares are very few and far between, with it delivering more unsettling events than straight up scary moments, which for a psychological horror game is hardly a problem. And it does create some great scripted events to cause you to tense up when you catch something moving out the corner of your eye. Things like a hairdryer activating aren't particularly frightening, but you being able to pick it up and discover that it isn't even plugged in is a fun touch. And whilst it's maybe cliche in movies, it's not quite something that happens very often in horror games, which still leads it to be a compelling event, at least for me. The jump scares were a bit of a mixed bag though, with some not really landing, others sort of working. The game has an unnamed ghost-like entity that appears at random parts of the game to steer the player in a certain direction, and sometimes it's unsettling and sometimes it can startle, but the animation used is very similar each time it appears, which can take you out of the moment a little when you see it doing the same thing more than once. As mentioned, the game's scares are very few and far between, and it leans more into its atmosphere. It's tense, and the game's scares don't quite manage to capitalize on that. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The storm that rages outside sounds convincing and really helps the atmosphere at the start of the game, but it eventually gives way to a deep, dark droning that sounds like air passing through a glass tube, before finally descending to the sound of people screaming and whispering with an infrasound-like rumble to back it up. Though the problem the game has with its soundtrack is that it's not a continuous piece of music, it's more of a loop. And for a brief moment, there's silence as it fades out and then starts up again, which can be a little immersion breaking. The environmental sound effects of the dead house are all pretty good. Things like the creaking floorboards play at random, and the metallic grinding of the overhead fan keeps the place feeling dated, and similar to other games that use a rusty swinging sound. The sound effects are probably stock, but they sound fine within the confines of the game. The effects for checking drawers for items and opening doors is as realistic as it needs to be, but things like footsteps sound strange on certain types of floor. But to be honest, even if you do notice these things, it's hardly going to break the immersion. There's no real voice acting besides the TV playing back an old cartoon that's not as creepy as I feel like it should be, and as for the game's directional audio, it works just fine. It would have made more sense to have more realistic reverb for the environments you walk through, but the stunted sound of the house makes the house feel more dead, which works in the game's favour. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. There's some bloody handprints here and there, and they may have been hints to the demise of the house's previous occupants. They're quite realistic even if copy-pasted. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. The game opens with some subtitles of the player characters saying that they've only been living in the house for 2 months and they're already moving out because of some strange events that they don't disclose, only saying that nobody believes them, and this does a good job building yet more anticipation. The story really begins though with the first note that describes how the previous occupant felt like the house was changing. And it's an unnerving bottled thought about something that could so easily be paranoid delusions or someone's incorrect perceptions on the house. The inside doesn't line up with the outside. Things have moved, changed shape. Things are closer than they were before, and this feels really unsettling to read somehow. Disappointingly, the game doesn't play into the shape-shifting house as much as the notes lead you to believe, with the progression being tied more to opening doors with keys than the house literally morphing. Besides this, you've got quite realistic and down-to-earth subtitles when you interact with objects. The player character is just as confounded as you are, and this makes them easier to relate to. Though at the end of the day, the game really feels like it's going to do something more with the things that it sets up, but the game's finale changes out what could have been something really great for an ending that feels underwhelming and then straight up confusing, making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst the atmosphere is really great and the story really felt like it was going to lead towards something unique, the game didn't follow itself and ended up feeling a bit typical when it finally reached the end. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion of horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I'd like to point out that whilst I didn't move out, I tried not to stay in the house and advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.